Well, it wasn't all that long ago. People began to settle in Indiana and southern part, especially along the river. Down along the river there, if you ever been down in that area, in that beautiful Ohio River, there are a lot of rocks down there, a lot of caves and things. And the lay of the land's a little bit different. Well, there's a gentleman that lived out, because there wasn't a whole lot of big cities during that time, so people settled here and there and yon, and pretty soon the cities began to build up. But there's an old fella that lived pretty much by himself out in a little old cabin tucked back in the woods near those areas where there were a lot of caves, and game was pretty plentiful at that time. And he didn't go into town much because all the food and stuff that he needed, he raised for himself in a little garden. Or then he hunted for his meat and stuff. He started out with 3 old hound dogs, but as time went by, as time does, the old dogs, they got old, and all of them passed on to greener pastures, all except for one. So finally there wasn't but him and that one old hound dog that he had. And, he grew little things in his garden, but things began to kind of change. The woods were being cut down, and there didn't seem to be quite as much game as there once was, and they had to go farther and farther afield to find anything. He had some bad issues with his crops, and this one particular year he didn't raise much of anything. About the only thing that lived was them beans that he grew, and he got so tired of eating beans, and him and old hound, they'd go hunting. Now old hound was called Calico. Now old Calico, he getting up on age himself, just like that gentleman, but they'd have to go farther and farther before they could even find anything to hunt. And he thought that was awful strange, because in that area there used to be a whole lot of game, deer and turkey and squirrel and rabbit. Hardly even seen a bird nowadays though. So it was getting on about the fall of the year, and they was out hunting and come back home empty-handed. Now he was hungry, and that old hound was hungry. There wasn't much except a few little, maybe a handful of beans in that old pot over there, and he was so daggum hungry. Now you gotta envision his cabin though. When you talk about cabin, now his cabin existed of one room. His bedroom, his dining room, his kitchen was all one room. His bed was near the fireplace. And like I said, he's getting old, and there were things and parts of that old cabin that need repaired. There's an old hole in the floor. He always meant to fix that hole in the floor. He never kind of really got around to it, but he was always fixing to get it done. Well, that evening, he just had terrible old, his old stomach was gnawing at him. He was so hungry. No hound, too. He gave that old hound about a spoonful of them beans, and what was left he ate up himself, which wasn't much. And he is still hungry. So he built up the fire, and he thought, well, I'll just go on to bed. I got nothing to eat. I lay down in that bed, and maybe I can get my mind off of being so hungry. That poor old hound, he laying out there up underneath the house, because the front part of the house is up off the ground a bit. No hound, that's where he'd stay, was up underneath that house, sort of on the edge of the porch there. Or sometimes he'd go out and he'd lay by the gate out by the garden. Well, this old gentleman, he's laying there in his bed. He just put a couple more logs on that fire to warm up. It's getting kind of chill at night. And he happened to hear something. Sounded like a scratching, something under the floor. He looked out the window, and old Calico, he was way out there by the end of the garden, out by the fence. It wasn't him. He looked around, didn't see anything, so he crawled up in the bed and pulled the covers up about him. Well, he'd not been laying in that bed too long, and then he heard that scratching again, and he looked, and he saw what looked like 2 big old long pointy ears come up out of that hole in the floor. And pretty soon the rest of the head popped up. It had an old long snout, and as it drug itself out of that hole, he could see the yellow teeth that it had and the yellow eyes, and the old body was about as long as old Calico, but it had a big old long thick tail. Well, that old thing let out a hiss and looked at him, scared that old fella so much. Well, right there next to the fire, he jumped up and grabbed a little axe and he flung it at that thing. whatever that creature was, and hollered at him and flung it so hard, and he hollered, and the thing let out a yell and a scream, and it went back down through that hole in the floor. Well, when he went over there, he saw laying on the floor was that old thing's tail. And it was like, you ever snatch the tail off old lizard, how it keeps wiggling? Well, that old tail was doing the same thing. That unnerved that old guy. He kicked it over there and kicked it up into the fire. It's all covered with hair and everything. At first, that thing began to stink and burning hair and stuff, but once that old hair got burned off of it, it started smelling pretty good. He thought it smelled like some sausage. He was so hungry. So he scraped that thing out of the fire, put it over in the pan, finished cooking it up. And he called old Calico in. He called, "Hey, Calico." And Calico come up on the porch, and he gave him a little bit of it and first, and that old hound just eat that all up. And then he started eating it himself, and he said, "Yeah, that's about the best thing I've had to eat in a long time. Tastes like a good old sausage." Now his old belly had got full, but he decided he better go over there and fix that hole in that floor in case that old critter come back. Now, he didn't know what kind of critter that was. He'd never seen nothing like that himself. It was a horrible looking thing, he thought, but his tail sure was tasty. So he put some old firewood over that hole and stuffed it full of a rag and put that firewood over it and moved a big old pot over there, hoping maybe that, if that thing came back, it'd keep him out. So he didn't think much more of it. He went over there and he laid down in the bed, and, with that full stomach and that warm fire and the blankets up over him, he about dozed off asleep. Well, when he was in that place that you get sometime, not really awake, not really asleep, he heard a scratching, like scratch, 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 scratch at the door. And he wasn't sure because, he wasn't really awake. And he sat up in the bed and he looked and he listened, and the door rattled a bit, and he heard that scratch, scratch, as if something was trying to claw through that door. And then he heard an awfulest sound, like a voice almost, and it was a growl over. It said, "Tailypo, Tailypo, I want my Tailypo." Well, he hollered out for old Calico. He didn't know where Calico was. "Calico, come, boy, come." Well, old Calico come in there, heard a screaming and a barking and a rustling on that porch, and then he heard the old hound chase that thing off way down past the end of the garden, run through that gate, just about knocked the gate off the hinges. And then finally, he didn't hear nothing. Didn't hear old Calico or nothing anymore. He is frightened because that thing, he remembered the teeth that it had and the eyes that it had. It just looked like it was something that was plumb evil, even though it had a pretty tasty tail. Now, so he crawled up in that bed and he got to thinking himself, if I can just make it to daylight, I'll be all right. I'll be all right if I can make it to daylight. So he gets back in the bed, all is quieted down, and he lays down in that bed and pulls that cover up over him, and then he hears another scratching, and then he hears what sounds like old Pan. And he sat up in the bed, he looked over there, and all them logs, and that Pan was still over that hole in the floor, but it sounded like the sound was coming out from underneath his old dry sink. And he could hear that, he heard it again say, "Tailypo, Tailypo, who's got my Tailypo?" Well, he pulled them covers up about him like that, and he pulled them up over his head, thinking maybe it'd be safe, but then he heard that thing, the scratching and the clawing across the floor. Tailypo. And then it got all quiet. And he thought, well, maybe that thing had left. And the sun was just beginning to come up. He could see a little bit of crack of light between the cracks in his old cabin there. And he peeked out from underneath that blanket. But he looked down, and at the foot of his bed, he saw all the old pointed ears come up, and long front paws with long claws on it, and it pulled itself up over, and with a grin that was pure evil and showing all of his teeth, it said, "Tailypo, Well, he couldn't stand it. He just frightened to death. He pulled the blanket up over him, and he could feel that thing when it crawled in the bed with him. And it crawled right up next to him, and he felt that claws of the front feet of that, and it wrapped around his side and lit right there on his old full belly and said, "There's my Tailypo." What? Well, wasn't a few days later, some folks came by the old cabin there. Door was wide open. Usually they was greeted by old Calico, but no hound come out there and greeted them. They opened up that old cabin, the door swinging open like that, and they peeked in. It was a terrible mess in there. The bed was all tattered and torn, and there's blood here and there. They couldn't find the old fella and old Calico. They didn't know what happened. Never did find a trace of either one of those two. And as years went by, that old cabin began to deteriorate and fall apart, and all got grown over, with ivy and grasses and things, and saplings began to grow up, and it was nothing left there but the old chimney and old fireplace. But some of the old coon hunters at night, when they go by there and late in the evening and the wind would be blowing, they thought that they could hear like a voice upon the wind saying, "Take